Have you ever had your property messed with by a group of self-important HOA members who thought they owned the entire neighborhood? Well, I did, and when they blocked me from fixing my own fence because it was too gaudy, I didn't just sit there. I turned the tables in a way they would never see coming. And it all started with a single bold move that changed everything in our quiet little neighborhood. Before we dive into this wild HOA revenge story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of these crazy property drama stories that will leave you speechless. Trust me, you'll want to hear every single detail of what happened next. The first time I received a notice from the HOA, I thought it was just a minor hiccup, a simple misunderstanding. My fence had been a point of pride. I'd chosen vibrant colors, intricate patterns, and materials that stood out from the cookie-cutter monotony of our neighborhood. It wasn't just a fence, it was a statement. But to the HOA, my statement was a violation, a breach of their meticulously dull aesthetic rules. I tried reasoning with them, explaining the effort, creativity, and cost that went into it. Their response was cold, dismissive, and ultimately, final. Your fence is too gaudy and must be removed or altered immediately. They even blocked my ability to make changes to my property, citing obscure clauses buried deep in their rulebook. Every email, every letter felt like a personal attack, and for the first time, I realized that these people thrived not on fairness, but on control. I watched as neighbors nodded politely, afraid to stand up, afraid to be the next target. It was infuriating, but it sparked an idea. If they wanted a war over aesthetics, I would wage one over something much bigger. For weeks, I studied their operations, their finances, and their weak points. The HOA was small but incredibly territorial. They had only one private road leading into the main community, which technically they owned, but relied on for access to their offices, maintenance, and meetings. That road was their artery, their lifeline, and it had no alternative route. The more I looked into it, the more I realized I could do something that would hurt them where they felt untouchable, their own control over property and accessibility. I started discreetly acquiring land adjacent to the road, negotiating with a few hesitant owners who didn't want to deal with the HOA. Each purchase seemed minor on its own, but together, it was the first piece of a puzzle that would soon become a game changer. By the third week, I had acquired enough of the land to legally purchase the stretch of road that the HOA considered theirs. It wasn't about money. It was about leverage, and suddenly I held the cards. When the official deed arrived confirming my ownership, I felt a surge of vindication. I hadn't broken any laws or rules. They had blocked my fence, but I had followed the law meticulously. The tables had turned, and now the HOA could no longer control me without risking their own access. I didn't announce my victory immediately. Instead, I let the tension simmer. I watched them organize meetings, send memos, and fret over maintenance, all while I held the power to cut off the only road they depended on. The real drama began when I finally decided to act. Without warning, the HOA members arrived one morning, expecting routine maintenance access to their road. Instead, they found it blocked, with official notices declaring that the road was now private property under my ownership. Their initial shock quickly turned to panic. Meetings were called, lawyers were consulted, and frantic calls were made to find any loophole or backdoor. But every legal argument they tried crumbled against the clarity of the deed I held in my hands. They couldn't trespass, they couldn't maintain their so-called territory, and they couldn't dictate anything about my property in retaliation, at least not without facing immediate legal consequences. For the first time, the HOA felt powerless, a sensation I had only dreamed of when they were dictating my life over a fence. I spent the following weeks enjoying the subtle chaos. Deliveries were delayed, maintenance schedules were disrupted, and internal conflicts among the HOA members escalated. They attempted to negotiate access, sending emissaries with polite but increasingly desperate pleas. I responded with calculated calmness, offering temporary access for a fee or conditional agreements, reminding them that every threat they had made against me now worked in reverse. It was beautiful to watch them squirm. Every email, every meeting was tinged with anxiety because they no longer held control. In meetings, I could overhear passive-aggressive discussions about the fence incident and how we underestimated the homeowner. The tables had completely turned, and it was intoxicating to witness. By the end of the first month, the neighborhood was buzzing with whispers of the feud. Some neighbors were secretly thrilled, others nervous, and a few outright terrified of what I might do next. I had become the wild card, the disruptor, the person who refused to bow to rules dictated by fear and conformity. The HOA tried public messaging, presenting themselves as cooperative and community-minded, but no one could ignore the fact that the road they had once monopolized was now entirely under my control. The balance of power had shifted, and I realized that my victory over the fence dispute had become more than just personal satisfaction. It had exposed the fragility of their entire system. The second chapter unfolded with the HOA scrambling to regain some semblance of authority. Lawyers were hired, letters were sent, and threats of litigation filled my mailbox. But every move they made was predictable and slow, while I had the advantage of calm observation and strategic patience. I focused on small legal maneuvers that slowly reinforced my dominance over the road. One by one, I added clauses to the ownership terms that limited the HOA's access, introduced scheduled use, and even created minor fees for unauthorized entry. Each step was fully legal, but designed to make them aware that control was no longer theirs. The tension built to a point where the HOA members began turning on each other, arguing over who was responsible for the fiasco and how to salvage their credibility. It was a slow, methodical unraveling of their authority, and I had a front row seat. Neighbors who had once been afraid now watched with intrigue and subtle admiration. Some discreetly approached me, hinting at relief that someone had dared to challenge the HOA. Others remained wary, fearing retaliation, but none could deny the spectacle of their beloved HOA unraveling under the weight of their own arrogance. For me, this wasn't about personal vendetta anymore. It had become a lesson in resilience, strategy, and the power of owning the narrative. I realized that the fence dispute, trivial as it seemed, had been the spark for a much larger transformation. I was no longer just a frustrated homeowner. I was a force that demanded acknowledgement, respect, and caution. The road blockage forced the HOA into increasingly desperate measures. They attempted mediation, public campaigns, and neighborhood meetings to restore their image and reclaim control. Each attempt failed spectacularly, either due to legal limitations or the simple fact that I had anticipated their every move. I kept meticulous records of every interaction, every notice, and every communication, creating a paper trail that legally protected me from any retaliatory actions. The HOA, once a monolithic force of conformity and intimidation, was now floundering, reduced to scrambling for solutions they had never considered because they had underestimated the power of a single determined homeowner. As the months passed, the dynamic of the neighborhood shifted. The HOA no longer had the quiet, unquestioned authority it once enjoyed. My ownership of the road became a symbol, a warning that rules enforced without fairness could be challenged successfully. The story spread quietly among neighbors, a legend of sorts, and I could sense the mixture of fear, respect, and relief that my actions had inspired. I continued to maintain the road responsibly, but always on my terms, reinforcing the lesson that control is not a birthright. It is earned and maintained with fairness, respect, and diligence. The HOA could no longer dictate terms without facing consequences, and the once invisible power structures of the community had been exposed for all to see. By the fourth chapter, the HOA was a shell of its former self. Members who had once prided themselves on authority were now cautious, constrained, and wary of every move. The internal disputes had intensified, with factions blaming each other for underestimating me and mishandling the situation. Meanwhile, I had solidified my reputation not as a troublemaker, but as someone who understood the law, the landscape, and the psychology of control. My fence, once a point of contention, now stood as a monument, not just of design, but of principle. Every passerby, every neighbor who peeked over at my vibrant patterns, understood the story behind it, even if they didn't know the details. It had become symbolic of resistance, strategy, and the consequences of underestimating a determined homeowner. Ultimately, the story ended not with confrontation, but with recognition. The HOA had learned that their rules could be challenged, their authority was not absolute, and that one person, armed with knowledge, patience, and a legal advantage, could rewrite the balance of power in a community. I had achieved more than revenge. I had established a precedent that fairness, preparation, and strategic thinking were far more powerful than arbitrary rules and intimidation tactics. And as life continued in the neighborhood, I observed quietly, satisfied in the knowledge that I had turned a trivial dispute into a story that would be remembered and perhaps whispered about for years to come. If you enjoyed watching me take down an entire HOA and flip the power dynamic in one bold move, make sure to hit that like button. Subscribe for more wild property drama stories, and turn on notifications so you never miss a moment of the chaos, strategy, and jaw-dropping revenge that only true homeowners can deliver.